Okay, welcome back to Shifting Views with Willis. Today, I just want to talk a little bit about the big news that's happening in the UK, and that is the post office scandal. This has got to be the best brackets worst example of a corporate toxic culture, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want to get too much into the detail of it because we're not experts and we're not we don't know the nuances of what's going on other than what the media tells us. But clearly, the employees of this company have been hung out to dry by the leadership of this company. That's a fair point?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's many corporations across the country, across the world probably, that have quite similar poor cultures where there's clearly a disconnect between the leadership of the business and the people on the ground that are running the operations. And if the post office scandal highlights anything, it's got to be that a poor culture in an organisation is not going to lead to anything good.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, the post office brand is about trust, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you read their annual report, which I haven't, I'm sure they would say that they're a trusted service, and it's a massive mismatch. Obviously, they didn't trust the people who work for them, and that's eventually found them out. And I think a big part of the investigation that they'd done was to really root out these people because the post office couldn't be wrong because the brand said it's trusted.
Yeah.
And they let that blind them, and effectively put the blame onto the people, and not listen to them.
And clearly, because there's the partnership there, isn't there? So they've rolled out this new Horizon IT system, which as innovation consultants, we're all for in terms of introducing new systems. The world's evolving. They've wanted to go more digital. The post office is typically, or has been typically for many decades, a very analog process of stamps and all the rest of it. So they're rolling out a system. We would recognise that's a good thing. But I don't know how this was done and whether this was piloted or whether they did this in milestones, whether there was sufficient training. But it shows that immediately, if you're going to introduce some new way of working in an organisation of that scale, this has to be done in small milestones and you have to be monitoring for errors and bugs because it's inevitable, surely.
Yeah, well, clearly there was, obviously there were bugs in the system, obviously. Yeah. And clearly their process of rolling that product out was not effective. You launch something, you test it, you make sure it works, scale it up, etc., etc. That clearly didn't happen in this case, did it? And they were aware that the system didn't work, but they hid behind that, didn't they?
Yeah. What amazes me about this whole story, and obviously it's got massive media attention now because they've made a TV show about it, the Mr. Bates TV show. Rightly so, people are absolutely outraged at the whole thing because clearly it's just pure, it's just unfair. The whole thing is just so unfair. But what amazes me about this whole thing is, if I understand the story correctly, they've rolled out this new IT system across the network. This IT system had bugs, so individual post offices started losing money. The sub-postmasters of those post offices were sort of saying to the company, well, look, we're doing everything we've always done. We're following, we're pressing all the right buttons that you've told us to press. Yep. I don't know where this money's going, but, I haven't got it. And then there seemed to be this culture of the leadership saying, well, you must be stealing it. You must be stealing the money. Mm-hmm. And then, maybe in the first couple of cases, you can understand an investigation into that saying, well, money's disappearing. But when the cases got into like the tens and then into the hundreds of cases, and all of these cases started after the introduction of this new IT system, surely any leadership would say, all right, well, clearly our post office staff haven't all just become hardened criminals. Most of these have been working for us for 20 or 30 years. Yep. They haven't just suddenly started nicking money across the country. Obviously, there's a problem. There's a flaw in the system somewhere. Wouldn't that be, what would stop a leader from immediately going to that common sense point?
They're probably not into the detail of it for a start, are they?
Yeah.
They believe they believe they're immutable, to use the word from earlier podcasts. But what they do is trustworthy, so there can't be anything wrong with it.
Yeah.
I mean, there were worse things that happened. That they actually incentivized the internal auditors to go and prosecute people. So you basically, it's a classic example of getting what you incentivize. If you bonus someone with a certain type of behaviour, and they go out and do that. And so people were looking for the most vulnerable people, the people who would be least believed, because they knew they got a bonus for basically catching them out, which again is reinforcing that bad behaviour.
In a corporate culture, clearly that's bad, but in a trusted organisation such as Royal Mail, the Post Office, to me that's akin to like incentivising detectives or police officers to convict criminals, and they'd get a bonus for every murder conviction they got or something like that. If you did that, there'd probably be more, because they would find any angle possible to kind of get that notch up. It's as bad as that, in my opinion.
Yeah, fundamentally. I mean, these guys are basically not trusted by their employer, and I would imagine a lot of people feel like that. You know, in a lot of places where you work, if you work for Amazon, for example, you have to wee in a bottle because you don't have time to do your deliveries. That's fairly pervasive in a lot of organisations, and these are the kind of organisations that have a toxic culture, a bad culture. They can't innovate because they know they'll be blamed for things that go wrong. So it's just a really good example of why culture is so important.
Yeah, I mean, and we talk about with our innovation clients, we say the 3 pillars of innovation are strategy, process, and culture. And we always emphasize the culture point because we say if you've got a toxic culture, the leadership aren't aligned with what's going on the ground, you're not facilitating your employees to be able to deliver good things for you and come up with ideas, then it's just a disaster. You know, I mean, it can't lead anywhere good. I think the post office thing is an extreme example of this because obviously we're seeing all the media and the absolute outrage, rightly so, as to what's gone on there. But I think if it highlights anything to any other executives watching, is that they need to be much more aware of what's going on within their organisation and much more sensitive to the people that are actually making that operation tick, which is the people on the ground, surely.
Yeah. Well, luckily for most executives and corporations, the BBC, or sorry, it's ITV in this case, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Are not going to come around and do a drama on every single bad thing that needs investigating. But it does show you that if you do engage with a topic and do it in an emotional way that shows the people and the human story and the drama of it, then it can change behaviour and unlock the right people to make the right actions, because this has been known about for decades and been reported extensively in certain media, but it's ridiculous that it takes a TV programme to sort this out, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also the tie-in, because I think it was Fujitsu, or certainly Fujitsu were part of this system, of the company that rolled it out. So there's an element of investment in there, isn't there? The post office have obviously invested a lot of money into this new system, and they don't want to be proven wrong, do they? They want to say, look, we've got this new fancy tech. It does everything it's supposed to do. If it's losing money, you guys on the ground are clearly doing something wrong. And then the people on the ground are helpless, these sub-postmasters, because mostly they're managing village shops, and they're sort of replying to them saying, I guess the leadership would, or the people that are prosecuting them, or the auditors or whatever, would be putting doubt in their mind, saying, no, you must be doing something wrong. You must be, because this system is flawless, and clearly you're doing something wrong. You're not using it correctly or whatever. And to some extent, I would understand that at the first early point of it. If there was a couple of offices that was losing money, naturally you would bring in somebody to look at this and go, oh, why is this place losing money? I understand that element. But immediately they've gone in there with what I assume to be very much a pointy finger approach. Yeah. They've gone in there with the attitude of these people must be stealing from us, rather than going in with the attitude of let's have a look and see what's this system doing and seeing, what's the timeline of events. An open investigation rather than an attitude to immediately find wrongdoing.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It'd be really good to know about the budget and how the project was run as well, wouldn't it? Yeah. Because presumably corners were cut, and that perhaps they didn't spend as much money as they should have spent on it. I don't know in terms of the system or the resources to test it. But fundamentally, they made a pretty bad job of something that probably quite a simple system. It's a calculator, isn't it? I assume. I don't want to minimise the whole thing, but it shouldn't be that hard.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the post office does a lot of stuff, doesn't it? And this system was, as I understand it, was quite complex. It was having to deal with a lot of things, from typical post office transactions all the way through to moving money around and all the things that the post office does. So it was quite complex, I think, in terms of what it had to do. Now, we would say from an innovation process point of view, these things have to be done in milestones, in small steps, where you're trying different elements of it. You're trying it in a small number of shops. You're reviewing the data from it. You're seeing how effective it is. You're looking at how the staff manage the system and how trained they are on it. And all of this, you're constantly collecting data, and that's informing the rollout, whether you continue, whether you change direction, whether you row back on it, whatever. I don't know to what extent that happened in the post office, but clearly there wasn't a good pilot process because the system was filled with bugs. It was obviously filled with bugs because they were losing money. Yeah. But what breaks my heart for this whole thing, for the people on the ground, is that some of these people have since died. Some took their own life. but some have since died, under the hammer of conviction of being guilty in their own communities, people looking at them as though they're stealing, which is awful. Some of these people went to prison. Some of these people had to plead guilty to the crime in order to avoid prison.
Yeah.
Which, it's all right hearing about that on the telly, but just put yourself in that position. Imagine going somewhere and you're completely innocent and they're saying, look, you need to tell them you're guilty because otherwise they're going to put you in a jail cell.
Yeah.
Does that not scream the most terrible culture possible? There's no support from the organisation coming down and saying, look, these people have been working for us for years, decades in some cases. We introduce a new system and all of a sudden we start losing money in all these different locations. Every bit of logic from a good leader would be, clearly there's a problem with the system. They haven't just suddenly rebelled and become thieves, in the hundreds. This is what drives me nuts. And maybe I'm oversimplifying it and I don't understand it correctly. But that just tells me that that's a terrible, terrible culture where the leadership of such organisation is almost like akin to Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Probably has no idea what goes on in a warehouse, He's so far removed from it. And there's all these points in between that and then the person making the delivery that it probably just gets lost in a translation of accusations and reports and stuff.
But fundamentally, that money was going onto their bottom line, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And finally into the pockets of shareholders. So, arguably, they're actually quite happy that they were getting that cash.
Yeah. And do you think maybe, we don't know, do we? But do we think that was probably a driver of it?
Well, I'm sure they didn't know that they were, that there was a direct link to it. But fundamentally, you're making money. Quite a significant amount of money. Where's that money come from? Surely they should have accounted for it in some way.
Yeah. So they've got an inquiry now, haven't they, that's going on, and there are all these people being, and Fujitsu and the post office have all essentially come out in there and said, actually, there were bugs in the system. And actually now it's transpired that they knew that all along and still continued with essentially the persecution of innocent employees, which I don't know how to answer that. How do you, what would incentivize you to, as a leader, to even go down that route? That's surely a moral issue as much as it is a business issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of what makes a good leader in an organization, your moral values play a huge role in this.
You need to trust your people and the people need to trust you.
Yeah. So what would be the message be to other, what would we say to other organisations in terms of using the post office as an example?
Well, the massive lesson really in culture, culture should inform everything you do. And if your culture or your organisational reputation is around trust, then you should create an environment where people trust one another, you trust your staff and they trust you. And obviously the post office has got a long way to pull back from the disaster they've had, at least in PR terms, around that today. But fundamentally, if your culture is a genuine culture and you've created that in a genuine way, then that wouldn't have happened, would it? Because people would have trusted one another. They wouldn't have blamed the staff. They would have wondered, well, we've put this new system in place. Is the system failing? But because they didn't have the trust, then going against their own culture, they blamed the staff.
The sad thing about it as well is, as I've said before, some of those employees had been working for that organisation for many years, maybe even decades in some cases. And that surely, for them, if anybody was looking at a career in an organisation, they would get to the point where they go, well, look, you know what? I don't really care about this career or this job because, frankly, the organisation doesn't care about me. I'm just a number. And if something goes wrong, they're just going to come and I'll be penalised for it, And I think that should be a worry for all organisations, shouldn't it? Your biggest asset, your best value are the people that are running the business.
But very often the people who've been there the longest with the most experience are the people who are made redundant or got rid of, reorganised out of the organisation because they're deemed to have contributed and they want to bring new people in. So as I say, I would imagine a lot of people in a lot of jobs in a lot of different companies would feel exactly the same. Yeah.
I think there needs to be, definitely from a leadership point of view and a culture point of view, and we talk about it from an innovation point of view as well. So we're saying, look, you have to have a good culture. If you want people to come up with ideas, you want them to care about the job, you want to evolve what the business is doing and try things out and all that kind of stuff, the people have got to feel valued. They've got to feel like they're heard. They've got to feel like they're not going to be shot down if they come up with an idea.
Yeah.
They can't feel the risk of losing the job, or in this case, being prosecuted and sent to prison. I mean, it's just like the most ludicrous thing going, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, I wish the people well that are fighting their case, because I think it's a terrible injustice, and I think most people would agree with that. But really, the purpose of this conversation is to say, if there's ever a terrible example of a toxic culture, this post office story is one, and it's not isolated. This stuff happens in organisations all over the world, for different reasons and different outputs, but fundamentally, the link is a pure disconnect between the people that are leading an organisation and the people that are making the organisation tick. And if you don't close that gap, the results can be dire.
Correct.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll leave it at that. We wish them well. I'll see you at the next one.
See you, Wayne.